Candidate Trump said it's time to get out. But now President Trump is changing tactics, recommitting the nation to what's already its longest war.
The consequences of a rapid exit are both predictable and unacceptable. My original instinct was to pull out. And historically, I like following my instincts. But all my life, I've heard that decisions are much different when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office. However, our commitment is not unlimited, and our support is not a blank check.
The president announced more troops in the region last night, though it's unclear how many more freedom for the military to make their own decisions on the battlefield, and the end of deadlines to get troops out.
Conditions on the ground, not arbitrary timetables, will guide our strategy from now on.
And President Trump put pressure on Pakistan and India to help stabilize the region. But is this the right way forward? Joining me to discuss are Graham Allison, a former Assistant Defense Secretary and now professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, and Charlie Sennett, a news analyst for WGBH and the founder of the Ground Truth Project. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks.
Graham, let me start with you. You were at the National Security Council back in May for a meeting focused on U.S.-China relations. Did the conversation that you engaged in there, and I don't want you to disclose anything you can't, but given what you heard during that visit, were you surprised to see the president take the approach he did last night?
Well, that's a good question, and the answer is no. I was very impressed with the conversation with his experts on China and Asia. Matt Pottinger, who's the President's Deputy National Security Advisor for Asia, and his team are very professional. And we had a 2-hour thoughtful conversation exploring all the elements. I'm also friendly with and a big fan of H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor. So I have no doubt that they produced a good study with real options for consideration by the president. But I think in the issue of this complexity, given McMaster, who's a general, and Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, who's a general, my bet would have been the generals will out with respect to this issue because it's very complex, and Trump, particularly at this point, needs as much support as he can find.
It may have helped also that Steve Bannon is not in the White House mix. Breitbart News, now with Steve Bannon at the helm once again, was very tough on the president right away last night. They said basically that he's taking the same approach that President Obama did when it comes to Afghanistan. The Taliban made the same point. The Taliban spokesman told the Associated Press that Trump's whole speech was old. And looking at the video, it seems like Breitbart and the Taliban may have a point. Let's watch.
We are not nation building again.
We have no interest in occupying your country.
Perhaps it will be possible to have a political settlement that includes elements of the Taliban in Afghanistan.
We will support efforts by the Afghan government to open the door to those Taliban who abandon violence.
Pakistan often gives safe haven to agents of chaos.
But this same cancer has also taken root in the border region of Pakistan.
So, Graham Allison, with all that continuity, what is new and different here?
Well, I think you're right to emphasize the continuity over the change. Basically, the Defense Department's analysis of this, and the general's analysis in general, is we should be there for as long enough doing as much as it takes to get to a point of success. Now, if you believe that when you're in a hole over your head, maybe the best advice is to quit digging, that's not a very attractive option. And so I think the advice that President Trump got was very similar to the advice that President Obama got. And in both instances, they went along in their first year in office with the general's advice.
Charlie Sennett, let's get you in here. You have reported a ton from Afghanistan. You were there right after the U.S. invasion in 2001. You were there recently for the big Forever Stand project that you guys worked on. In Forever Stand, you were focused on women's education, Afghan millennials, among other topics. For the Afghans that you know, what should they be enthusiastic about that President Trump had to say last night?
I think they're enthusiastic that the president is signaling that the United States is not going to leave. When you talk to young people who really believe in the future of Afghanistan, or when you talk to people who believe in the idea of the possibility of a democratic government there, I've met very few who are in favor of the United States pulling out anytime soon. So I thought it was encouraging last night to hear the president reconsider his campaign rhetoric and shift toward listening to the generals on this one about trying to go after this policy. It is, of course, hard not to roll your eyes when he says, I realized it's more complicated than I originally thought.
Like healthcare,
yeah,
and like other,
I mean, this is
North Korea.
The pattern of this presidency is to suddenly embrace the complexity. But in this case, making a good decision, I think, going forward with the troop increase. I would say, though, and I'd love to hear Graham's thought on this, too, the thing I didn't hear is the diplomatic component. You know, you have a military effort and a military approach, but without diplomacy, it's not going to do well. And this president has not been strong on the diplomatic side.
I think he made one reference to it when he said he's going to bring to bear all the elements of American power, economic, diplomatic, and military. But it was an afterthought. What about, again, in terms of the Afghans that you know, what about Trump's assertion that we're not trying to reconstruct societies in our own image, that we're not asking people in Afghanistan or elsewhere to change their way of life, which is really counter to the approach that President Bush took when we went into Afghanistan. Should that scare, for example, those girls who you profiled who are now able to get an education that they weren't 20 years ago?
It's a good question. I don't think it would scare them because I think as long as they know that the U.S. is going to keep a military presence, hold on to those advisors, and try not to lose any more ground than they have already lost. You have to remember that there has been tremendous amount of lost territory to the Taliban in recent years. Right now, the rate of killing of Afghan national forces is about 30 a day. So this is a real hemorrhaging. There's great concerns, but I don't think the concern would be that the United States is going to abandon what I think is the most successful element of the entire U.S. presence in Afghanistan, which is the education of young girls. I think we're going to stay with that. I think the Afghan people trust that we're going to stay with that. And that's really the big message I think young millennials would take from the president's speech in Afghanistan. Thank God you're staying in.
I'm glad you mentioned the attrition. The New York Times, that's where I read the number, 31 Afghan military members killed on a daily basis, along with 9 Afghan civilians. Graham, the president seemed to imply that Afghanistan wasn't doing enough to shoulder its share of the burden in this fight. What more could Afghanistan be doing that it isn't?
Well, I have been quite skeptical about our engagement in Afghanistan right from the get-go. I thought that the CIA efforts that toppled the Taliban initially in the first 3 or 4 months were about right, and that since then we've made more mistakes than than successes. So I think the Taliban, in my view, that we picture as terrorists, are a substantial number of them people that like to live in their own valley and mind their own business. And when you come into their valley with a platoon and say, we're in charge and we're going to tell you how you behave your lives, they fight you. They've been doing this for a few hundred years. The British experienced this. The Soviets experienced this. So basically, the proposition that the Taliban are prepared to fight anybody who wants to come and tell them that is local Afghan Pashtuns are prepared to fight anybody who comes into their region who wants to tell them how to behave. It's been a long story. And I would say that's the story we've seen. I think when we had 100,000 troops there, we managed to push them back a little bit. Now they control about a third of the country. We control about a third. I think if we take another 10 years, we'll end up roughly where we are now.
Well, I guess the million-dollar question here is, at what point can the United States, if this point is even attainable, say we've achieved what we want to achieve and now we can exit? What might that point be, Charlie?
You know, there's a famous phrase you hear in Afghanistan a lot, which is, you in the West, you have the watches, we have the time. They measure, change in centuries, if not longer. And so I don't think we're going to see anything anytime soon that's going to look like a victory to us. But I do think if we can keep stasis, if we can keep it a stalemate, and we can allow the Taliban to recognize that they are going to have to be part of a political solution and not a military victory, that's the point at which, when we really feel we have held on to that, when the gains have been made in the girls' schools and in building a democracy, then I think we can hopefully begin the pullback. But I think it's a long time off.
That's such a tough ask, too, if you are a member of the U.S. military, this small group of people in the country, right, who've inordinately borne this burden. That'd be tough. That'd be tough.
Well, and there's a reason why Charlie called this the forever. Yeah. So basically, the current path is a forever path, as far as I see it. And I don't believe that the costs of the effort are worth the forever undertaking.
So you're hoping that it wraps up maybe a little quicker than Charlie thinks it might. Is that a fair assessment?
I think, to agree with Trump's original instinct, Bannon and Breitbart is not comfortable for me, but a broken clock is right twice a day.
All right, we got to leave it there, unfortunately. Graham Allison, Charlie Sennett, thank you both.
Thanks,
Appreciate it.